I was at work when I first watched the movie The Conjuring, directed by James Wan. Now, I'm not much of a believer in the paranormal, and outside of watching The X-Files or my obvious love for the Ghostbusters films, my list of familiarity with the horror genre is quite limited. Although I can still remember sprinting up the stairs of my childhood home after being convinced of impending attacks by the boogeyman. But I was taken in by the story of The Conjuring, the supposed true story of The Conjuring, specifically about the two demonologists that were portrayed, Ed and Lorraine Warren. During this speech, I hope to impart some information that I find fascinating about Ed and Lorraine Warren, about their history, and about some of the cases that they worked on. Now, Ed and Lorraine Warren were a couple who, throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, traveled the globe investigating alleged hauntings. According to an interview in Entertainment Weekly in 2013, the couple traveled as far as the United Kingdom as well as Japan. In fact, there was an interesting tidbit about a British man who had become possessed by a werewolf demon with his ears actually growing pointy. In the interview, it was learned that Ed had been fascinated with the supernatural from a very young age after seeing the ghost of a recently deceased landlady in his house. Now, according to a website for the New England Society for Psychic Research, the house that Ed grew up in was in Connecticut. Now, Ed recalls his father, who was a police officer, explaining to him that there was a logical reason for everything that happened in their house. Ed actually goes on to detail his first encounter with a ghostly spirit, which I'll now recount. My family would all go to bed around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Many times I would hear the closet door beginning to open. At first I'd look into that closet and see only shapeless darkness. Then slowly I'd start to see a light beginning to form, and it would morph into like a ball shape, sort of like a basketball, and then I'd begin to see a face in that ball. That is called a ghost globule. In that globule was a face. It was the face of an old woman, and she was not looking at all pleasant. The globule would then come out of the basement and go into my bedroom and be accompanied by audible footsteps and heavy breathing. The room would then become icy cold, an unnatural cold, a psychic cold. And I'm saying to myself, Ed, there's a logical reason for everything, but by the time I said that, I was out of my bedroom and in between my mother and father in their bed. Now, I too would have been terrified had something like that happened to me. But Ed was able to turn this nighttime terror into a focal point for the rest of his life. In fact, after Ed married Lorraine, he would actually seek out homes that had believed to have been haunted. Lorraine claimed to be a gifted clairvoyant with the ability to see into the spiritual realm, although she viewed it more of a curse. She recounts that on the very first night that she went on a date with Ed, she actually foresaw that he would be the man that she married, going so far as to writing about it in her journal after their date. An excerpt from the article Ghost Hunters Did Not Always Stop Their Prey, written in 2013 for the Daily Telegraph, explains that the couple was certainly famous during their time. However, they gained true notoriety when they were called into Long Island to help George and Kathy Lutz after they fled their home in Amityville, New York in 1976 due to a haunting. This incident was obviously made famous by the movie The Amityville Horror. The movie The Conjuring, however, is based on their dealings with the Perron family. Roger and Carolyn Perron moved their family of 5 girls to a farmhouse in Rhode Island in 1970. In an Entertainment Weekly article, Andrea Perron, the eldest daughter of Roger and Caroline, recalls living at the farmhouse. Now, according to Andrea, who wrote a 3-volume history of the haunting called House of Darkness, House of Light, 8 generations of one family had lived and died at that farm. Through historical research, it was found that virtually every entity that they were able to identify had either died by their own hands or had died so sudden a death that they didn't realize that they were dead. Now, according to Lorraine, the Perron case was one of their most difficult. In an interview with the Daily Telegraph, she recalls that Bathsheba Sherman was the force that was haunting their house, the farmhouse. Local folklore actually claimed that Bathsheba was a witch. Now, ultimately, the Warrens were unable to remove her, and they had a falling out with the Perron family. Another interesting little bit of history that I was able to locate was about Ed and Lorraine's house in Connecticut, which is actually home to an occult museum. It includes all manner of artifacts that they were able to collect through their many investigations. Unfortunately, it's by appointment only, so you can't just go knock on their door and say, hey, I want to take a look. Well, that's my speech about Ed and Lorraine Warren. As this is a short speech, I've only just touched the surface on some of their interesting tales and fascinating cases. Luckily, James Wan is hopeful to turn more of their stories into movies, so maybe we'll be seeing them on the silver screen again in the future. If, however, you are interested in seeing more of their works, you can also check out the 2009 film The Haunting in Connecticut, 2014's film Annabelle, or the movie Poltergeist, which, according to an article by Kate Erbland, drew heavily on the investigations of the Warren family. Well, that's my speech, so thank you very much for watching.